Hi literature lovers and food friends, it's Diana, and I am here with part 2 of 1984. It's been quite a little while since I talked about part 1, and part 2 is so different. And one of the things that's one of the things I noticed was the comparison from 1 and 2. So let's get into it. The food in 1984 that I'm looking at is gin, and I'm just going to say first off, there's hardly any mention at all of gin in part 2, where it was all over the place in part 1. It's almost nowhere. So part 2, we've gone from part 1 where everything if it smells bad, and the prominent color is gray, and the prominent thing is dirt, and in the last moment of this that look at the world, the girl slips Winston a note that says, "I love you," and he now has a reason to live. And it's not so much that he has admired her from afar and hoped to meet. He actually at some point thought of bashing her head in. So it's not personal to her. He doesn't know her name yet. Her name is Julia, and he can't wait to connect with her, but they have to be very careful. So there's a lot of time spent going through their regular lives, and that is where one of the mentions of gin is. And it's at the very beginning of that section. It's on page 109 of my copy, and it says, let me get my trusty copy. He wolfed another tasteless meal in the canteen, hurried off to the center, took part in the solemn foolery of a discussion group. It's so funny, the solemn foolery of a discussion group, because it's making me think about literature and how discussion groups are not, okay, maybe some people think of them as foolery, but I think of them as interesting. I guess you have to be interested in whatever's being discussed to not think the discussion group is foolish. Discussion group played 2 games of table tennis, swallowed several glasses of gin, and sat. So now the next time that gin is mentioned, he and Julia have a relationship. I'm going to take a minute for the park. It's not the park. It's not a park. It's the country. We get a glimpse of greenery and birds. And there's no telescreens. Though he does mention you have to be aware that maybe there's a hidden microphone. So not totally out of being oppressively watched, but a little lightning. And I kept thinking, why the heck don't they move to the country? If this is the country compared to the city, why are you living in the city? I don't have an answer for that. I wonder if that's about life too. So one of the comparisons that I find in this is we go from a sensual deprivation, everything's gray and dirty, to an explosion for the senses. And there's a big thing about a thrush, I think it's a thrush, singing. Winston had dropped the habit of drinking gin at all hours. He seemed to have lost the need for it. So makes you wonder about that gin. So many things. And I have 2 things I want to talk about. I want to talk about singing, and I want to go back to the food. So the beginning, when he meets Julia, there's a bird singing, and he talks about how this bird just doesn't seem to have a reason to doing it, just singing for the sole purpose of singing, or singing out of joy, but no practical reason to sing. And then a prole is outside a window, and this woman keeps singing. And she's not doing anything exciting. In fact, she's doing laundry. And she keeps, like old school laundry, where you hang stuff up on the clothesline. I actually have fond memories of clotheslines. We had them in our backyard when I was a kid. I think everybody had them. And there were these 2 T-poles. So what I mean is they're shaped like a T, and they face each other. Just in case you've never had what do you call it, clotheslines in your ever. So they face each other. When I had my first house, the deed restrictions didn't allow clotheslines. This has nothing to do with 1984, but that made me like clotheslines even more because I couldn't have them. Okay, so the prole woman is doing laundry, and while she's doing, and she's singing a propaganda song, and Winston goes in to explain how these songs come into existence and how they're created, and they're created by machines. Just when you think 1984 might be outdated, you get a look at AI creating art. Interesting. It's like the thrush. So there's this comparison, or this line or theme or motif running through of singing out of joy, and kind of the question becomes, what do they got? What do they have? When I've been in a bad place in my life and then came out of it, I remember thinking, oh, I can tell I'm in a better place because I'm singing. And I make up little songs. I've mentioned that before. Like I'm like Frances from Best Friends for Frances. I make up little songs as I go. And that's one of the ways I can tell that I'm happy. I make up silly songs to entertain myself. And so Winston is getting these glimpses of life. And then another thing, before I go to the food, that's where I was going. Before I go to the food, I'm going to say this, that Winston had gotten that journal that he got at the beginning. The place he got it is this little shop in the area where the Proles live. I'm jumping about because there's so much. There's so much. And one thing makes me think of something else. So I am coming back. So that's Mr. Charrington. That's how I think of his name. It might be different. We'll just call him the old antique man. That's the old antique man's shop. And Julia and Winston have been meeting in different places, and they say something like, we can only meet twice in one place before we have to change, because they can't be caught. And they know at the beginning that what they're doing is going to lead to their death, that they will be taken to the ministry of love, which is where you get tortured. So they know that's coming, but they can't stop themselves. So eventually, and he talks to the owner of this shop, and the owner lets him kind of rent the upstairs. It's got a bed, it's got a stove, it's got a picture, it's got no telescreen, and it's got a window, and the window is through that window that they hear the prole woman singing. Political act. So sex has gone from being like an enema, which is how Winston describes it in part 1, to being a political act, to it becomes, when they move into the top of the antique store, it's more like they're playing house. They've set up house. They can't get married. Winston's already married. It's becoming like a real relationship where they can spend time together, where they can laze around. And at one time she puts on makeup and that kind of thing. Okay, so here she is. She says, just let me show you what I've brought. And she's come into the room of the top floor of the antique store. Did you bring some, this is still Julia, did you bring some of that filthy Victory coffee? And she says, look what I've brought. And she opens her bag. Underneath was a number of neat paper packets. The first packet that she passed to Winston had a strange and yet vaguely familiar feeling. It was filled with some kind of heavy sand-like stuff which yielded whenever you touched it. It isn't sugar, he said. Real sugar, not saccharin. Sugar. And here's a loaf of bread, proper white bread, not our bloody stuff, and a little pot of jam. And here's a tin of milk, but look, this is the one I'm really proud of. I had to wrap a bit of sacking round it because, but she didn't need to tell him why she had wrapped it up. The smell was already filling the room. It's coffee, he murmured. Real coffee. So she has these things. Oh, and tea. She does have tea, and she says it's real tea, not blackberry leaves. So she has these bits of real food that she brings, and they bring with them aroma and taste and a feeling of home. They're creating a home. And all this is against the law. It's all very dangerous. To me, that's a big thing. We get a glimpse of what the party has taken out of life and how little is needed to bring life back. Some things that smell good and taste good, some time alone, some agency. Like I get to choose what I do with my time and who I spend it with and what I do with my body. So it's very little, and Winston starts to want to live again. He also stops drinking the gin. He gains weight. The varicose ulcer, he has some, I don't know what a varicose ulcer is, but whatever it is that bothers him in his leg goes away, and he's just starting to live again. Now, the other big thing that happens in part 2 is they become so secure in what's going on that he reaches out to O'Brien, and Winston is just sure that O'Brien is part of the resistance, and that O'Brien, through something with his eye, has signaled to Winston that they're on the same side, which is, I guess it's hope. I don't know. Why would Winston trust O'Brien? But his home space is not dirty. He has a servant. He can turn off his telescreen. He's got real food. Oh, he serves them wine, and you will get the book. And the reader of 1984, like me, can also read the book. I have read the full book. I'm going to say it's very, very dry. Goldstein, the big hated guy, the one they have the 2-minute hate about. Goldstein wrote the book, Emmanuel Goldstein. And Goldstein was setting up the world in which the party exists. This is like here is how this world works. But it was Goldstein who is now held up as an enemy to the party. While Winston's reading the book, they're up in the top of Mr. Charrington's antique place, and the prole woman is outside singing, and this is where their fantasy world falls apart, because Mr. Charrington is a member of the thought police, and they both get arrested. It all fell apart. It couldn't last. Part 2, it's the fantasy in the middle of the horribleness. And the last line of part 2 says, "It occurred to Winston that for the first time in his life, he was looking with knowledge at a member of the thought police." It had to happen. It couldn't last. They knew where they were headed. They were right. They got an all-out taste of what life could be, what it used to be. I'm going to say what it should be. Not that it can't have gin in it, but it maybe shouldn't have gin in it that you have to drink to get through your day. And it doesn't have to have chocolate in it. But if it does have chocolate, if you're gonna eat chocolate, it should be enjoyable. Why bother with chalky chocolate? Not worth it. Off Julia and Winston go to torture. So how is that going to go? How's food going to be brought in to that? How are we going to see I'm pretty sure the gin shows up again. It's very hard to go, okay, but I'm going to try to do it. So sad, Julia and Winston sad. Okay, well, who knows what next week will bring. This week we got a glimpse of happiness. We had some happiness and taste, yay! And I'll see y'all next time. Like and subscribe and tell people and share and read and comment and question and eat some chocolate, some real chocolate. Bye.